I'm Jen Rayfields. I'm coming to you from Basking Ridge, New Jersey. I'm really excited to do this evening's lesson on crowding out. So let's get right into it. Okay, so the goal for tonight is to explore topic 5.5, which is called crowding out. So we want to be able to define that term, and we also want to be able to explain using graphs how fiscal policy can cause crowding out. In yesterday's lesson, Mr. Romano talked with you about deficits and debts, talked with you about how the government pays for deficit spending with borrowed money. So we're going to connect that to this concept of crowding out. But the skill we're focusing on this evening is 3B, where we want to be able to determine the effect or effects of one or more changes on other economic markets. And so this is where the complexity comes in for crowding out. The term itself is pretty simple. It's not that hard to graph, but we want to be able to connect crowding out to a number of different things in a variety of ways. And so this is what I think you'll be able to do when you're ready for this topic on the AP macro exam. So you want to be able to use a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market to illustrate the effects of fiscal policy on real interest rates. Then you want to be able to explain how and why changes in real interest rates cause a change in private domestic investment spending. We want to be able to define crowding out and use an ADAS model to illustrate it graphically. Then we want to explain how and why changes in private domestic investment spending cause a change in a country's real economic growth rate. So you can see skill 3B emerging here, right? So we want to be able to explain the effects of fiscal policy in the long run. We want to be able to describe how fiscal policy affects interest rates, how that affects, in turn, affects investment spending, and how changes in investment spending affect economic growth. Then finally, we want to be able to describe policies that might offset crowding out or the effects of crowding out. Okay, so those are our goals for the lesson. So yesterday, Mr. Romano left off with this question and asked you to take a look at it so that I could review it with you today. So if you haven't already done so, I'm going to suggest you just take a look, skim this quickly. I'm going to go through it with you. If you're watching this after the fact, you can pause the video now, answer the question, and then watch us go through the answers. So like I did the other night, I'm going to split this up into its component parts. So let's start with part A. So we're told that the economy of country Z is operating on the upward sloping portion of its short run aggregate supply curve, and then asked to assume that the government increases spending. How will the increase in government expenditures affect each of the following in the short run? So the first, when recognize that an increase in government spending causes an increase in aggregate demand because government spending is a component of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand in a closed economy is consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending. So an increase in government expenditures is going to cause an increase in aggregate demand. Now, if we have a short run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping, and let's hope that in reverse this is looking right, but if the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping and we have an increase in aggregate demand, we have a movement up along a given short run aggregate supply curve. So the short run aggregate supply curve itself is not going to change. An increase in aggregate demand causes a movement up and along a given short run aggregate supply curve. All right, so the second part of the question, part B, asks us to use a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to show the effect of the increase in government spending on real output and the price level. So whenever you see those words, correctly labeled graph, pull your mnemonic device to mind. So think ACE. You want to ACE your graphs. So when you ACE your graphs, you have correctly labeled axes. So when we're using the ADAS model, we have price level on the vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis. We want correctly labeled curves, that's our C. So in this case, we want aggregate demand and we have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And then we want to always include our initial starting point, right? What's our equilibrium point? So this is skill 4A. Drawing a correctly labeled graph is 4A. When we show the effect of a change on a graph, this is for skill 4C. So we have to show the effect of the increase in aggregate demand on real output and the price level. And so we shift our aggregate demand to the right to reflect the increase in aggregate spending. And then we show that output increases and the price level rises. So that's how we approach part B. So part C is pretty similar. We're assuming that the government funded the increase in spending by borrowing from the public. And you learned yesterday that when the government borrows from the public, it does so by issuing bonds or treasury securities. So using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, we're going to show the effect of the increase in government borrowing on real interest rates. So we're told in the question what we need to include in our label, in our model, right? So we're graphing the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds. We want a downward sloping demand for loanable funds curve. We want an upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve. We want an equilibrium real interest rate and an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. So again, there's skill 4A, can we draw a graph? And then skill 4C is, can we show the effect of a change on a graph? So in this case, the increase in government borrowing is going to increase the demand for loanable funds. Remember, the demand for loanable funds represents borrowing, and we're going to show that it produces an increase in the real interest rate. So don't forget to make sure you aced your graphs by including directional arrows. All right, so here we've got a complete answer to parts A through C for this question. And that's what you would need to do to earn all those points. Okay, so since we're putting a lot of things together in this lesson, I want to review some terms and definitions that you've studied in previous units. But remember, one of the things about economics is that the language of economics is really precise, and we want to make sure that we have an economic understanding of the terms and definitions that we're using, as opposed to sort of a common or a layperson's understanding of those terms. So I know you guys know what interest rates are, right? Interest is the price of borrowed money. We talk a lot about nominal interest rates in Unit 4 and with monetary policy. So a nominal interest rate is the stated or named interest rate. When you go to the bank and you say how much for a loan, the rate that they give you is the nominal interest rate. And remember, it's a function of the real interest rate and the expected rate of inflation. The amount you're willing to pay for borrowed money is a function of what you expect, in part, inflation to be. But that is going to be strongly influenced by the time horizon that you're looking at. So when we've graphed the money market, we've looked at nominal interest rates. And now when we're using the loanable funds market, we're using real interest rates. So remember that the real interest rate is the actual cost of borrowed money. By the time this loan is paid off, what was the actual interest rate? So the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. So we're using the loanable funds model and the real interest rate. Some of you might have textbooks that label the vertical axis of the loanable funds market with a nominal interest rate given some expected rate of inflation. And that's correct as well. But there's a reason why I'm making this point, and we'll get into it in a second. So investment spending, as you learned way back at the beginning of Unit 3, private domestic spending refers to private domestic investment spending, or I in your aggregate demand formula, or in your real GDP expenditure approach formula. I is domestic spending by firms on capital stock. So let's unpack that term. Capital stock refers to the amount of capital goods that are available for use in the production of goods and services. So let's just remember what capital goods are, right? Those are the goods we use to produce other goods and services. And so this is factories, production facilities, assembly lines, tools, equipment, retail space, transportation fleets, the ovens in a restaurant, the coffee machines at your local coffee place. Those are capital goods. So I like pictures of big factories with lots of physical capital in them to illustrate what investment spending looks like. These are investment spending is something that you want to think of as being being expensive for the purpose of AP macroeconomics. It helps us understand why why investment spending is interest rate sensitive, because most firms have to borrow money in order to pay for it. Okay, so firms regularly pay for investment spending with borrowed dollars. And you might also want to remember that spending on a newly constructed home is considered investment spending. And it's also almost always paid for with borrowed dollars, right? A home mortgage is the demand for loanable funds to buy a house. In AP macro, it's appropriate to assume that short-term borrowing by firms is a function of nominal interest rates, right? So in the short term, in a country with stable prices like the United States, even when we have 1 or 2 or 3% inflation per year, short-term borrowing is a function of nominal interest rates, because if you're paying back the loan tomorrow, if you're paying back the loan within 3 months, the rate of inflation is really negligible. So in the short term, the nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate when you're talking again about an economy where there's a lot of price stability and a low rate of inflation. So investment spending, right? Investment spending that's expensive, you're looking at the long-term borrowing. And that's when we go to the real interest rate to see how investment spending is affected. Okay. All right. So all else equal, remember this. When the real interest rate rises, investment spending falls. And when the real interest rate falls, investment spending rises. Again, always all else equal. So we use the loanable funds model to describe, predict, and explain how changes in the demand for and the supply of loans determines the real interest rate, and also how changes in the real interest rate affect the quantity of loanable funds demanded and supplied. So this is review as well. Remember, in the loanable funds model, the demand for loanable funds represents the demand for borrowed money. Okay, when firms borrow money, they can take out a loan, or they can issue corporate bonds. So you can think about the demand for loanable funds as the demand for borrowed dollars, but it's also the supply of bonds, because when governments borrow money, they issue bonds, and a lot of times when big corporations borrow lots of money, they issue corporate bonds. So when the real interest rate is high, the quantity demanded of loanable funds is low, and as the real interest rate falls, we see an increase in the quantity demanded of loanable funds, right? All else equal, the lower the real interest rate, the more profitable investment spending projects are likely to be. Okay, so the final thing to review is economic growth. So economic growth is very loosely defined as very generally defined as an increase in the productive capacity of an economy, which is basically an increase in the amount of output that an economy can produce over time. So as of the fourth quarter of 2019, according to the St. Louis Fed, GDP for the United States, real GDP, was $19.22 trillion. We can graph economic growth as a function of real GDP in terms of time. Okay, so now if the economic growth rate was 0, then this is what the real GDP growth rate would look like. We'd see that in year 1, real GDP was $19 trillion. In year 2, real GDP was $19 trillion. In year 3, GDP was $19 trillion. So a horizontal line, a current output or current real GDP would indicate 0 economic growth per year. So what I did was I took 19.22 trillion and I applied some different growth rates to it to see what an economic growth rate curve might look like, or economic growth might look like. So you see that you have a curve with 2 points of inflection and 3 different rates of growth. So the first rate of growth here is at the bottom. That's 5% growth per year. So if that $19.22 trillion increased by 5% from 2019 to 2020, and then 5% again from 2020 to 2021, and so on. Now, the curve, if the economic growth rate increases, then that curve is going to steepen. So there's 10% growth per year over those years from about 2022 to 2026. And these are just numbers that I made up to illustrate how changing economic growth rates change the slope of the real GDP over time curve. So then finally, I wanted to see what 15% growth per year would look like. So you can see as the economic growth rate increases, the real GDP, this curve gets steeper. So if we were growing at 15% per year, and all of a sudden economic growth was slowing, let's say that we started growing at only 10% per year, or even 5% per year, you can have a decrease in the economic growth rate and still have economic growth. Okay, so you want to understand the concept of an economic growth rate for the purposes of understanding the long-run implications of fiscal policy and crowding out. All right. Okay, so now what do you need to know in this unit? What do you need to know in this topic? So the first thing you need to know is the relationship between the government budget balance, fiscal policy, and real interest rates. Mr. Romano really introduced you to this last night, so this is going to be a little bit of a review, but let's just put it all together. All right, so I like to use this kind of a number line to conceptualize the budget balance and connect it to the loanable funds market and real interest rates. So remember, when receipts equal outlays, the government is said to be running a balanced budget. The budget balance is zero. When receipts are less than outlays, or when spending is greater than tax revenue, the budget balance is said to be in a deficit, right? The budget balance is less than zero. The government is operating in a deficit or running a deficit. When receipts are greater than outlays, when revenue is greater than expenses, the government is said to be running a surplus. The budget balance is greater than zero. All right, so now let's assume that the government implements some expansionary policy. So the government can either cut taxes, which makes R get smaller, or it can increase spending and transfers, in which case O gets bigger, or it can do both, right? You can have a tax cut combined with an increase in government spending. All of those, right? No matter what option you choose, right, you're going to see the budget balance move towards a deficit. If R gets smaller and you're in a deficit, the deficit is going to get bigger. If R gets smaller when you're operating in a balanced budget, the budget's going to move into a deficit. If R gets smaller and O gets bigger when you're in a surplus, then you're going to move towards a deficit, right? So regardless, expansionary fiscal policy is moving us towards a deficit. So what does that look like in the loanable funds market? So an existing deficit will grow larger because the government has to borrow more money to pay for the increased deficit spending. So when we increase the government borrowing, the demand for loanable funds goes up, which causes an increase in the real interest rate. You can see it here. Now, if the government was operating a balanced budget and it starts and it engages in expansionary fiscal policy, a balanced budget will become a deficit, in which case the government has to borrow money in order to pay for it. So we see an increase in the demand for loanable funds, which drives up the real interest rate. Now, when Mr. Romano took you through some economic history last night, you saw that it wasn't very common for the United States over the past 50 or 60 years to have a surplus, but it does happen. And so if the government is running a surplus and decides to engage in some expansionary policy, the result will be it spends down the surplus, which moves the budget balance towards a deficit. If we don't know the initial budget balance and we don't know the size of the policy, we can't say whether we'll end up in a surplus with a smaller surplus, we'll end up with a balanced budget, or we'll end up in a deficit, but we can say it moves towards a deficit. And we could show the spending down of a surplus as a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. But look what happens. Real interest rates rise. So what conclusions can we draw? And this, again, this is a really important expression, ceteris paribus, all else equal in the absence of no monetary policy, in the absence of any other changes, expansionary fiscal policy leads to an increase in the real interest rate, regardless of the initial condition of the budget balance. So you want to be able to walk that through, okay? Understand that if you know your starting point, you know that the expansionary policy moves you towards a deficit. Regardless of where you started, real interest rates are going to rise. You want to be able to do the same type of thinking for contractionary fiscal policy. So again, you could start by remembering that when receipts are less than outlays, we have a deficit. When receipts are equal to outlays, we have a balanced budget. And when receipts are greater than outlays, we have a surplus. If the government enacts contractionary fiscal policy, it can raise taxes, which makes R get bigger, or it can decrease spending and transfers, which makes O get smaller. So either way, we're going to be moving the budget balance towards a surplus. So if the government is operating in a deficit, it's going to require less borrowed money. So there would be a decrease in the demand for loanable funds. If the government was operating a balanced budget, the government moving into a surplus will become a surplus, right? So as the government runs a surplus, it's saving money. It's got money in its bank account. We see that as an increase in the supply of loanable funds. An existing surplus will get even bigger. So whatever the government's bank balance was, that bank balance goes up, that's loanable funds. So we'd see an increase in the supply of loanable funds. But again, look at what happens to interest rates. If we have contractionary fiscal policy, regardless of our initial condition, real interest rates are going to fall. Okay, so you want to be able to, again, walk that through. All else equal, contractionary fiscal policy leads to a decrease in the real interest rate. Here it is. And you want to be able to explain how that happens for any given initial budget condition. Okay? All right, so what's the second thing you need to know? Now you need to know the definition of crowding out. And so we're going to go back to that relationship between real interest rates and investment spending, and you can probably anticipate where this is going. Crowding out is a term that's applied to the decrease in private domestic investment spending that results from the increase in real interest rates produced by the increase in government borrowing, or a decrease in government savings that results from expansionary policy. Okay, that's it. That's the definition. It's the decrease in private domestic investment spending that results from an increase in real interest rates produced by expansionary fiscal policy. That's crowding out. All right, now, how do we show that in an ADAS model? That's the third thing that we want to look at. So let's assume that the economy is in a recessionary gap and that the government is currently operating a balanced budget. That means the budget balance equals zero. It means receipts are equal to outlays, revenue is equal to spending. All right, in a recessionary gap, we know that current output is less than potential output. So here's a recessionary gap, okay? Y1 is less than YF. And now we know that if we want to try to use economic policy to stimulate aggregate demand, we can employ some expansionary fiscal policy. Remember, AD equals C plus I plus G plus XN. So we want to either increase government spending, right, to get G to go up, or we want to cut taxes to get C to go up. So if the government implements some expansionary fiscal policy, okay, we're going to attempt to close the gap. So this will cause aggregate demand to increase. Okay, so AD1 shifts to AD2. We have a new equilibrium here at full employment levels of output. So we saw that output went up, unemployment goes down, the price level rises, and now the economy is operating at full employment levels of output. But if the government was operating a balanced budget and it implements some expansionary fiscal policy, it's going to move the budget balance into a deficit, which will require the government to borrow money, which is going to increase the demand for loanable funds, which is going to drive up real interest rates. So that's going to cause investment spending to go down. Since investment spending is another component of aggregate demand, the decrease in investment spending is going to cause another shift of aggregate demand. So here's our goal of our expansionary policy, but one of the unintended consequences of that is the increase in real interest rates, which causes I to go down. So where we end up is that this aggregate demand this aggregate demand 3 curve at a new equilibrium with a new price level falls, output falls, unemployment goes up. Okay, let's sort of show that again so you can see it. This is how you graph crowding out. The goal of expansionary fiscal policy is to close a recessionary gap. We want to increase government spending or cut taxes to stimulate aggregate demand. However, expansionary policy in this case is going to cause government borrowing to go up, which is going to drive up real interest rates, which is going to cause I to go down. We show the decrease in investment spending by shifting aggregate demand back down. When you hear the expression complete crowding out, what they're talking about is all of the increases in aggregate demand that result from the fiscal policy are counteracted by the decrease in investment spending that results from the increase in interest rate. So this would be partial crowding out. Complete crowding out gets us at 83 back here where we were on 81. Okay, so you want to make sure that you can walk through and graph crowding out, expansionary policy, offset by a decrease in investment spending. Okay, and that's what it looks like. All right, so now the next part of the puzzle, the next sequence of events asks us to predict how the economic growth rate of a country is going to be influenced by crowding out. Okay, so this is goes back to the review work we laid out before we got into the what you need to know part. So remember that private domestic spending drives economic growth. So we'll put a lot of these terms together here. Investment spending is spending on capital stock. The more capital stock a country has, the greater the productive capacity of that economy to produce goods and services. So productive capacity refers to the amount of goods and services you can produce, and it's a function of how many resources you have. So our resources are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So if our Increases in productive capacity are a function of how many resources we have. Investment spending is what contributes to the amount of capital. Okay, so a change in investment spending is going to change the rate at which capital stock is added to the economy. So that's the tie-in between investment spending and economic growth. So, and you have to connect those dots. You have to talk about capital formation, additions to capital stock, changes in productive capacity when you're connecting investment spending to economic growth rate. Okay. All right, so all else equal, a decrease in investment spending causes the economic growth rate to slow because fewer capital goods are being added to the economy's productive capacity, or capital formation is occurring at a slower rate. Okay, that's how you describe that. All right, crowding in is the opposite. And crowding in refers to the increases in investment spending and the increases in aggregate demand that would result from contractionary fiscal policy that decreases interest rates. So contractionary policy can drive down interest rates, which could crowd in investment spending, and crowding in could increase the economic growth rate. Okay. All else equal, an increase in investment spending causes the economic growth rate to rise because more capital goods are being added to the economy's productive capacity than before. All right, so let's do a concrete example. So let's assume that annual investment spending equals 100 billion and the economic growth rate is currently 4% per year, and that the government is currently operating in a budget deficit. Okay, that's our starting point. That's our initial condition. Okay, the government cuts taxes, which decreases government revenue, right? Or government receipts. Okay, well, that causes the government budget balance to the negative budget balance to grow larger. The deficit increases, right? We move into a bigger deficit. Okay, I apologize for that. There's a real increase in internet usage in my neighborhood with all of the online schooling and all of the at-home working. So hopefully you had time to think about the answer to that question, and you have determined that the economic growth rate will be, in fact, less than 4%. Okay, so these are all the steps you want to, this is the reasoning that you want to have going on in your mind when you're considering the relationship between expansionary fiscal policy, real interest rates, investment spending, and economic growth. So that's skill 3B. They don't get more skill 3B than that, putting all of those dots together. Okay. All right, so the final topic in this is what actions can be taken by policymakers to offset the increase in interest rates caused by expansionary fiscal policy. And you might be able to predict this. And if you're watching the news, you're seeing it in action right now. So we know that the government just passed a massive expansionary fiscal policy, $2 trillion. It was the size of it, the largest expansionary fiscal policy package in our nation's history. And the week before, simultaneously, what was going on, the Fed was conducting major increases in the rate at which it was adding money to the money supply in order to try to offset some of the economic problems that are resulting from the situation we currently find ourselves in. So if you can connect those dots, you can think about the role that monetary policy can play in terms of mitigating the increase in real interest rates that could be caused by expansionary fiscal policy. So this is going to allow us to show skill 3B in a slightly different way too, because very often on the AP exam, you are asked about you might be asked a question like, how could the Fed counteract the effects of the fiscal policy on real interest rates? You could be asked a question of questions about simultaneous monetary and fiscal policy on interest rates and investment spending. So these are the steps that you want to be able to walk through. I alluded to this when I did, when Mr. Romano and I did lesson 5.1, because we were looking at expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, but only on what was going on in the ADAS model. Now we can add in the effects on interest rates and investment spending. So we know that expansionary fiscal policy is designed to stimulate aggregate demand, to cause real GDP to increase, to cause employment to rise, and one of the short-run consequences of that is an increase in the price level. There's our Phillips curve. All right, now what happens to interest rates because of expansionary fiscal policy? They go up. What happens to investment spending? It goes down. So now when we do expansionary monetary policy, you'll remember it's also designed to increase aggregate demand. It's also going to stimulate spending to increase real GDP. Employment will go up, unemployment will go down, and it comes with, in the short run, some increases in the price level. But expansionary monetary policy or increases in the money supply cause interest rates to fall, which can cause investment spending to rise. Okay, we'll get into a little bit more detail how to connect the nominal interest rates in the money market to real interest rates in the loanable funds market when we get into our review videos. But the effect of expansionary monetary policy is to drive down interest rates and increase investment spending. So if you're asked a question about the effects of simultaneous monetary and fiscal policy, if they're moving together, if they're both expansionary, the effect on economic outcomes is determinate, but the effect on interest rates and the effect on investment spending are going to be indeterminate because we don't know which policy is going to have a stronger effect on interest rates. Okay, so we're bringing multiple concepts together here in this. All right, this contractionary monetary policy can mitigate the decrease in real interest rates that might result from contractionary fiscal policy. So be sure you can understand and explain how expansionary monetary policy can offset crowding out, but you also want to make sure you can walk through the effect of opposing policies on all these variables, as we started to do in lesson 5.1. All right, there's another way to approach enacting some expansionary fiscal policy that is unlikely to produce an increase in interest rates, and that's to take a balanced budget approach to fiscal policy. So this is going to review a little bit about multipliers, and if this is something that's a little fuzzy for you, don't be too concerned about it. We are going to review multipliers in great detail when we do our review topics. But remember that government spending is a more powerful tool on aggregate demand than changes in taxes or transfers. And you might remember that the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save, and that the tax and transfer multiplier is MPC over MPS, marginal propensity to consume over marginal propensity to save, and it moves in opposite directions. This just means inverse. Okay, so if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, then the spending multiplier is 4 and the tax multiplier is -3. So what does this look like? What would a balanced budget approach to fiscal policy look like? If the government raises spending by $10 billion, once the multiplier kicks in, right, aggregate demand will eventually go up by a total of $40 billion. So increase in government spending by 10 billion produces, when the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, will lead to a maximum increase in aggregate demand of 40 billion. Now, if the government simultaneously raises taxes by 10 billion, right? So this is expansionary, this is contractionary, right? Aggregate demand will go down by 30 billion because the tax multiplier is 3. There's no autonomous change in aggregate demand, right? When the government cuts taxes or raises taxes. So what's the net effect on the budget balance? There's none, because if you raise spending by 10 billion and you pay for it with increased tax revenue of 10 billion, you're not going to affect the budget balance, which means the government's not going to move into a deficit or into a surplus, which means there's not going to be any change in the loanable funds market. But you still get some expansionary effect because an increase of 40 billion, which is offset by a decrease of 30 billion, still produces an increase in aggregate demand of $10 billion. Okay. All right, so that's something that you want to sort of understand, is if you wanted, if there might be a question like, if the government wanted to engage in expansionary fiscal policy and didn't want to cause crowding out, what could it do? The answer is it could raise taxes by the same amount, because the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier. You're still going to get some expansionary effect. Obviously, an expansionary effect of 10 billion is less than an expansionary effect of 40 billion, but there's not going to be any crowding out because you're not going to have the government borrowing more money. Okay. All right, so let's go through how to approach this in an FRQ, and then we will finish up our lesson. So I'm going to switch to the document camera now, and we're going to do this on a piece of paper. So you're looking at the FRQ from 2014. This is question 1, and we're just going to do parts A, B, D, and E. So assume the economy is currently operating below the full employment level of real GDP with a balanced budget. Well, we know that if that's true, then Y is less than YF. That's our recessionary gap. And we know that our balanced budget equals 0. Okay, that's a big clue that loanable funds is coming up. All right, draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and show each of the following. So we want Y1 and PL1 and YF. So when you draw your graph, you're going to ace it. Give yourself a nice size graph so that you can show the changes you need to. So we're graphing the price level and real GDP. We want a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. We want an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. I always recommend that you find your equilibrium, your current output and price level first, and then use what you know about the condition the economy is in to show you where you need to put your long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so there's our current output and price level, PL1 and Y1, and our full employment level of output that indicates a recession. So if the government increases spending on goods and services by 100 billion, which is, there it is, financed by borrowing, how will the increase in government spending affect cyclical unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment? So cyclical unemployment is the deviation between the natural rate of unemployment and the actual rate of unemployment. So in this case, the natural rate of unemployment is the level of employment at full employment levels of output. And if we're producing less output, then our cyclical unemployment rate, our actual unemployment rate is higher than our natural unemployment rate. So the goal would be to increase output by stimulating aggregate demand. The more output we produce, the more workers we need. We're going to have a decrease in cyclical unemployment. So you would just answer the question by saying cyclical unemployment rate will fall. Then B2 asks us what happens to the natural rate. So remember, the natural rate equals frictional plus structural unemployment. It's not cyclical. It is not influenced by demand side economic policies. So there's no change in the natural rate of unemployment. All right, we're skipping part C, and then we're going to go to part D, which asks us to use a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market to show the effect of the $100 billion increase in government spending on the real interest rate. So it's really nice that they're telling us that we're looking at the quantity of loanable funds because it's a loanable funds market, and we're told we're looking at real interest rates. So real interest rates. We have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds curve. We have an upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve. We have an initial real interest rate, and we have an initial quantity of loanable funds. So there's skill 4A. We have to show the effect of the increase in government borrowing, right? Because the government has to borrow money in order to be able to pay for this $100 billion increase in spending, and that is going to produce a new equilibrium point in the loanable funds market, and there's our increase in the real interest rate. Okay. All right, then the last part of the question is, based on the real interest rate change in part D, what is the effect on long run economic growth? And the answer is the long run economic growth rate will go down because the decrease in investment spending causes a decrease in the rate at which capital stock or productive capacity is added to the economy. So a decrease in the rate at which capital stock is added to the economy. Okay, so that's how you approach answering a question that asks you to tie all of these elements together. All right, so I'm just going to take this, I'm going to stop this, go back to our PowerPoint, and we will finish up. Okay. All right, So here are the learning objectives for tonight. Define crowding out and explain how fiscal policy can cause crowding out. And we want to connect it to the loanable funds market. We want to know how it affects interest rate sensitive private domestic spending, investment spending, and we want to understand the long run impact on economic growth. And we looked at connecting a lot of dots, which puts this into the skill 3B category. So these are the things that I hope you now are able to do as a result of our time together. And you can test yourself and see how well you're doing with these concepts by doing this practice question for homework. And Mr. Romano will review it with you tomorrow when he picks up with topic 5.6, which is economic growth. So if you're at home now watching this live, take a photo. If you're watching this after the fact, go ahead and pause the video and take a crack at this question. All right, the final note is that we want to just remind everyone that the College Board knows that not everybody who really would like to take the AP exam has access to a device or internet connection in a way that would make it possible. And we're hoping that if you or if you know someone who needs a mobile tool or connectivity, that you reach out to cb.org/tech. All right, everyone, this brings an end to our lesson on crowding out. Thank you so much for joining us. Take good care, and I'll see you in a few days.